No mai haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, inga reo, ina mana, inga waka. So my name is Nick Smith and I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at Te Here Inga Waka, Victoria University in Wellington. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome friends, family, distinguished guests, professional and academic colleagues to the inaugural lecture of Professor Joanna Mossop. I often say, and I'm only being semi-facetious when I say it, that one of the jobs of the Vice-Chancellor, in addition to running the university, is to live vicariously through the achievements of others. And Joanna has given me a long list of achievements for which I can do quite a lot of living for tonight. She built a base on those achievements by doing a double degree at this outstanding university, and indeed in this outstanding Faculty of Law. She was then admitted to the New Zealand High Court as a barrister and solicitor in 1997 and began her career as a solicitor at Buddle Finlay. After that, she then worked as an assistant Crown Counsel in the Crown Law Office before heading overseas to Columbia University, where she completed her Masters of Law in International Studies. Thankfully for us, she returned to Aotearoa to work at this law school in 2003, first as a lecturer, then as a senior lecturer, then as an associate professor, and to here we are today as a full professor. For those of you who know Joanna's work, we're incredibly lucky to have her. Her research interests include dispute settlements of the sea, in matters regulation of continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, protections of marine diversity, marine resource management, and oceans government. And at a time when our oceans are rising and our temperatures are increasing, that body of work is increasingly more and more relevant. She's considered a global expert in the continental shelf. Her book, Continental Shelf Beyond 200 Nautical Miles, Rights and Responsibilities, jointly won the J.F. Northey Memorial Prize for the best legal book by a New Zealand-based author. She's been involved in negotiations for a new treaty in conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and has published widely on the topic. She's known, as so many good academics are, not just within her field, but beyond her field as well. She's a legal advisor to Mauritius and the Seychelles, which I commented to her as we were walking in, which seemed to me to have provided wonderful opportunities for holidays in addition to work. She responded rather dryly that was during COVID, and so it meant Zoom conversations in the middle of the night. But this is the first time in the world that any two countries have sought to establish a regime together to govern the use of the oceans beyond that 200 nautical mile limit. She's a member of multiple editorial boards, including the leading multi-interdisciplinary journal for oceans, marine policy, and has been active in the Australia-New Zealand Society of International Law. Also as academics who move not just within their own field, but also do enormous service beyond the university and also internal to the university. And Joanna was no exception. She was the Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Law. And also, and I think this actually points to a very exciting next 45 minutes or so, she's a renowned teacher within this university. Her teaching was recognised with an Excellence Award in 2018. And just yesterday I was talking to one of our students, and I often ask them in the mystery shopper mode who their favourite academic and their favourite lecturer, and this student looked at me without pause and said that would have to be Professor Mossop. So that bodes well for the lecture that she's about to give on reimagining the law of the sea. She's going to talk about evolution and she's going to talk about revolutions, specifically asking whether changes to regulate ocean activities more sustainably can be achieved through the evolution of the law, or more specifically, if the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and existing processes provide sufficient basis for responding to new challenges, or if revolution is needed. It's my great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, to introduce Professor Joanna Mossop.
Tēnā koutou, kua hui hui mai nei. E mihi ana ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohe. Aha koa no tā wāhi o ku tūpuna I tipu ake o I ngā motu. Nō re rā, e mihi ana ki te hou kāinga o tērā rohe. Ara, te maunga o Taranaki, me te awa o Waiwhaki Iho. E noho ana o ki te whanganui atara, e mahi ana o he kaiako ki te herenga waka. Ko Joanna Mossop toko wingawa. Nō re rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Nick. I'm not quite sure who, if that was actually me you were talking about. But thank you everyone for coming. I've just explained that although my ancestors came to Aotearoa from other places, I was born and grew up in New Plymouth under Mount Taranaki. In that vein, I want to acknowledge my family who are here today, including my father, who still lives in New Plymouth. However, I have lived and worked in Wellington for many years and am very proud to have worked at Te Herenga Waka for over 20 years. And it is really wonderful to see you all here today. I occasionally get asked, why do I study the law of the sea? Which is a highly specialised area of international law and indeed something that not many people know about, including the students, many of the students who sign up for my Law of the Sea course. But ever since I wrote my honours paper on fisheries during my undergraduate law degree, the law of the sea has really held my imagination. Most of us don't really experience the sea much further than when we go to the beach, perhaps going surfing or fishing. Indeed, my husband and I are keen snorkelers, and I've had a long sense of awe and fascination about the kaleidoscope of life below the waves in places where humans can only briefly venture. The slideshow prior to my lecture was my attempt to share that wonder with you. The ocean covers 70% of the planet's surface, and it is a place of incredible extremes, of remoteness, of temperature, and of ecology. Indeed, today, just before the lecture, I was reading that scientists have just discovered that there are species of tube worms that tunnel underneath the seabed in search of new hydrothermal vents. And this ongoing discovery of new and amazing things about the ocean, it just really is fantastic. So the majority of us don't engage a lot with the ocean directly, but it is incredibly important to our lives. It's a road. 98% of New Zealand's imports and exports travel by the ocean. It provides food. Billions of people rely on seafood as the key source of their protein. It is a source of important minerals and hydrocarbons. In addition, the ocean is essential to our health. 50% of the oxygen that we breathe is generated from the oceans. It also regulates our climate. Ocean currents are crucial to our climate. The ocean absorbs 25% of carbon dioxide emissions and captures 90% of the excess heat that is generated from those emissions. The ocean also plays an important, sometimes essential role in social and cultural values. Despite this importance, how we use our oceans is having a detrimental effect on its health. Overfishing continues to deplete ecosystems. The Food and Agriculture Organisation estimates that around 35% of commercial fish species are either overfished or depleted. Although work has been done to try to reduce the environmental impact of fishing quite successfully in some areas, in other areas it has not been as successful in that species are caught as bycatch, or the impact of the fishing techniques themselves can be very detrimental to the environment. Pollution from a variety of sources, including land and sea, are sometimes only adequately managed. We've all seen the pictures of plastic pollution, and plastics are now being found in the most remote part of the ocean, including the Mariana Trench. At the deepest part is 11 kilometres below the surface of the ocean. The impact that humans are having on the ocean is only exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. Oceans are suffering from record heat waves, which are wiping out species or forcing them to relocate if they are able to do that. The increasing acidity of the water caused by the absorption of too much carbon dioxide prevents coral reefs, shellfish, lobsters and more from forming their shells and skeletons. And personally, I see that sometimes when I'm snorkeling and it is heartbreaking. Indeed, the picture in some ways is very bleak. So the question that I want to address today is how well is the law of the sea placed to deal with the challenges that I have just outlined? Spoiler alert, I will argue that it faces some significant problems. In that case, how can we shape the law of the sea to ensure that the oceans have a more sustainable future? And because that's quite a large topic, many of my comments tonight are going to focus on fisheries. To begin, I'm going to take us back to 1982. In addition to the release of the film E.T. and the start of the Falklands War, there was one other important occasion in 1982, and that was the conclusion of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, often referred to as UNCLOS. UNCLOS has been hailed as one of the most successful international treaties in history. In one swoop, albeit a swoop that took 10 years to negotiate, UNCLOS resolved many issues among states about the extent of maritime zones, rights of navigation, rights of exploitation of living and non-living resources, maritime scientific research, and many more. It has been hailed both as a constitution for the seas and as a living treaty capable of developing and adapting to meet new challenges. Now, this adaptation is unlikely to happen through the amendment of the treaty itself, as there is little appetite both among foreign affairs officials and many academics to reopen the careful balancing that UNCLOS represents. Instead, evolution of the law has occurred in an incremental fashion. For example, shortly after the conclusion of the Law of the Sea Convention, problems were identified that needed further elaboration, and to do this, a couple of new treaties were signed in 1994 and 1995, which tried to expand and elaborate on the obligations states owed in relation to deep seabed mining and highly and migratory fish stocks. And I want to pause here to say that I am a huge advocate for the majority of what UNCLOS does. It has brought incredible stability to the ocean and the way that countries interact on that ocean, and has been the basis for orderly development of the law in a whole range of important issues, including, for example, shipping and pollution from vessels. However, I think we also have to acknowledge that the law of the sea has not prevented the creation of an increasingly degraded marine environment, negatively impacted by human activities and exacerbated by human-induced climate change. I believe that this is due in part to the fact that states often view the ocean primarily as an economic resource. Most states, or many states, have significant interests in a range of activities, including fishing, mining, and oil. And those vested interests underpin the political positions expressed in international fora. Certainly, many of these states also accept that the oceans must be used sustainably, but for others, their positions are driven by an interest in maximising the value that they get from the ocean. Many of UNCLOS's provisions on issues like fisheries are driven by old-fashioned approaches that refer to fish as living resources, and more modern approaches to environmental management, such as ecosystems approaches and the precautionary approach, and valuing biodiversity, have had to be retrofitted onto a regime that still reflects somewhat outdated values. In 2018, I published an article, as you can see on the slide, Can We Make the Oceans Greener? Trying to argue that the green obviously refers to environmental friendliness and not the actual colour green. And I talked about the successes and failures of UNCLOS as an environmental treaty. In that piece, I argued that despite important progress made in UNCLOS towards environmental protection, a number of structural and other failures have prevented it from being a truly transformative treaty. So I'll just talk to you about a few of those issues that I identified. And one key issue is the fixation on the freedom of the high seas, particularly when it comes to fishing. The concept of fishing, of the freedom of fishing, was predicated on the idea that every state could send their fishermen out and to collect fish with no detrimental impact on the ocean, and that would meet the needs of everyone who wanted them. And this is clearly in modern times not true. Since the 1960s, we've had the language of the tragedy of the commons to describe the fact that common resources with no limit on access will inevitably be used unsustainably. Although the law of the sea has imposed important limits on the freedoms to fish, Rosemary Rayfuse has argued that the reification of the freedom, or at least any rate the rhetoric of freedom, hinders the ability of the law of the sea to develop in a way that addresses multiple challenges posed by contemporary and emerging ocean uses. In the words of other scholars, the default position is that states can fish until they agree not to fish. Other structural issues in the law of the sea include the strong dependence on exclusive flag state jurisdiction and the existence of open registries and flags of convenience. Another issue is the doctrine of pacta tertius, that states are only bound by treaty rules to which they agree. And this is another problem when trying to govern resources found in commons areas where no state has territorial jurisdiction. Another issue is that UNCLOS did not create a body with overarching responsibility for addressing new and emerging issues that arise in respect of the ocean. Although we have a number of institutions that address sectoral issues, such as the International Maritime Organisation, the International Seabed Authority, or regional fisheries management organisations, there is usually very little coordination between them. When narrowing in on the governance of fisheries on the high seas, we see more problems. Because of the principle of freedom of fishing, the only way to ensure sustainable fisheries has been the creation of regional fisheries management organisations, or RFMOs. Only states that join the organisation are bound by the rules generally, although the Fish Stocks Agreement did expand the scope of those rules in important ways. While some RFMOs have managed to achieve sustainability, as many as 67% of high seas fish stocks are depleted or overfished. Although RFMO treaties do contain a mandate to consider environmental protection, studies have suggested that the priority and sole focus of many member states has been to guide the exploitation of fish stocks. Some RFMOs use consensus decision-making, which requires all states to agree before a conservation measure can be implemented, and this can make it difficult to achieve limits on fisheries activity. Even where the RFMO has a majority-based decision-making process, states are usually able to object to a conservation and management measure and opt out of implementing it. In addition, the RFMOs are often a fairly closed club. Only states with a real interest in fishing are entitled to join them, and new entrants often find they are allocated no or limited quota. The fact that decisions in RFMOs are made by those interested in fishing mean that even more conservation-minded states find it hard to make progress. The accountability of RFMOs to the rest of the international community for their management of this common resource is paper thin. Although some RFMOs are now undertaking peer reviews of their performance, states outside the organisation have no ability to influence decision-making or hold members responsible for failures in management. That's a very grim picture, but let's have a look at see where we can go from here. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, bit of a mouthful, issued a report that identified the dire state that biodiversity and ecosystems are in. The authors of that report argued that improvement in biodiversity management required transformative change, meaning a fundamental system-wide reorganisation across technical, economic and social factors, including paradigms, goals and values. This was a call to action, and it's a call that hasn't really resonated too well. But it has led me to wonder whether law of the sea can also achieve transformative change to protect biodiversity. I'm now going to address the traditional approach to developing the law, which I'm referring to as evolution. And this is indeed the way in which law of the sea has developed to date. Professor Karen Scott from Canterbury University recently identified 12 ways in which the rules laid down in UNCLOS can be developed to meet emerging needs without amending the treaty. These included negotiating new treaties, developing soft law or guidelines, and seeking progressive interpretation through courts and tribunals. The mainstream view of UNCLOS tells us that evolution in the law is the only way to deal with challenges and problems. And certainly the evolutionary or incremental approach has underpinned my scholarship for most of my career. However, of late, I have become increasingly uneasy about faith that incremental evolution will be sufficient to meet the new and serious challenges facing the ocean. In 2018, my answer to the problems I identified was to focus on the negotiations for a new agreement in the United Nations, focused on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and whether that could soften some of the structural problems that I identified in the article. So I want to now turn to those treaty negotiations because it's a process I've been involved in as an academic observer on the New Zealand delegation. And I think it tells us something about the promises and limitations of evolution as a means to solve the difficult problems that we face. I should also say that nothing in this talk reflects the views of the New Zealand government. I'm sure they'd be happy for me to say that. So that process began in 2006 when the United Nations General Assembly convened a series of ad hoc informal working group meetings to discuss a variety of issues that related to biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this process, because in international law everything has a hugely long name, is known as the BBNJ process for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. This slide shows the variety of maritime zones created by UNCLOS. Now, states have jurisdiction over fisheries and some other activities out to 200 nautical miles from their coastline. And the areas that were being discussed in the BBNJ process were the areas beyond any national state jurisdiction, namely the high seas and the deep seabed area. Now, a wide range of issues were raised during the initial meetings, but states were very divided at the beginning as to whether a new treaty was needed or whether the challenges could be met through existing institutions. In 2011, agreement was reached on 4 key areas that would form the basis of a new treaty. And I'll just briefly outline those. The first was the legal regime for the exploitation of marine genetic resources used for the development of biotechnology. Understandably, UNCLOS was silent about the rules for developing biotechnology because it just simply wasn't a use that was envisaged when it was negotiated. From the beginning of the BBNJ discussions, there was a clear division between industrialised countries that wanted to apply the freedoms of the high seas to that activity and the global south who wanted the principle of the common heritage of humankind to apply, and I'll come back to that concept. Negotiations for a new treaty did establish a legal regime that applied to the access and use of these resources. Importantly, that included a benefit sharing approach, but it didn't explicitly rely on freedoms or common heritage. The second issue was area-based management on the high seas. There is no basis in UNCLOS explicitly there to create marine protected areas and other area-based management tools, especially those that might address more than one activity, fisheries and mining and so forth. The treaty negotiations explored how such areas might be identified and established. Third, the treaty negotiations focused on elaborating the process for conducting environmental impact assessments for activities on the high seas. And these will need to be undertaken when states are planning activities that might have a negative impact on the marine environment. Finally, the issue of capacity building and marine technology transfer for developing states was a key issue for the Global South. So in 2018, an intergovernmental conference was convened to negotiate the treaty. The final meeting was held in March this year, and the treaty was adopted in the United Nations in June this year. And the treaty, as I said, is commonly referred to as the BBNJ Agreement, but it's also sometimes referred to as the High Seas Treaty. Negotiations for the treaty were very difficult, despite the fact that more than 10 years of discussions preceded the beginnings of the negotiations. The current geopolitical climate particularly made multilateral processes much more fraught than in the past, and one delegation in particular seemed keen on throwing spanners in the works at every possible opportunity. The positions of states in the global north and the global south were very far apart on a wide range of very important issues. Even in the last session, the differences were so great that the final day of the negotiations began at 9 a.m. on Friday, ran through the night into the next day, and it was only 9 p.m. the following night that the president of the conference announced that an agreement had been reached. And even a few hours before that point, no one had been really confident that there would be able to be agreement. So it was a really tremendous activity, and it shows how difficult it was to bridge the positions held by a range of different states. There is no doubt that the new agreement is incredibly important. It develops the law of the sea in some very important ways in relation to the 4 elements of the treaty. There are now clear processes for undertaking environmental impact assessments and establishing marine protected areas. Rules about accessing marine genetic resources are set out, and provisions have been made for benefits to flow to the global south. The agreement also created institutions that could develop norms on these issues even further. The creation of a regular meeting of the Conference of Parties goes a long way to filling some of the institutional gaps that I identified in my 2018 article. The key question I have been asking myself, however, is this enough? Does the BBNJ Agreement demonstrate that iterative evolution is sufficient to resolve the sustainability problems facing marine biodiversity? And I'm going to just now tell you 3 key ways in which I am less optimistic about this approach than I was when I wrote my article 5 years ago. First, and probably most importantly, the treaty does not apply to existing institutions such as RFMOs. One of the political compromises that were made in 2011, when the agreement was reached as to what a potential treaty would cover, was that the agreement could not undermine relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional, sub-regional and sectoral bodies. This means that the BBNJ Agreement could not undermine RFMOs. Of course, what it means to undermine was different to each delegation. Those with significant interest in RFMOs tended to take the view that the BBNJ Agreement could not touch on fisheries issues if an RFMO exists. Some argued that fisheries should be excluded from the treaty altogether, which in my view was ridiculous, given that the subject of the treaty was marine biodiversity. That position, fortunately, did not prevail. However, the BBNJ Agreement and decisions of the COP cannot override RFMOs or require RFMOs to take any action. For example, if the COP identifies an area that requires a marine protected area on the high seas, only the RFMO that applies to that area will be able to decide if fisheries restrictions can be imposed. And given the problems with RFMO decision makings that I alluded to earlier, there is a real possibility that the COP may identify and designate an MPA, but the RFMO may refuse to take any protective measures in that area. The main potential for the BBNJ to influence RFMO decisions is through the actions of states that are members of both the BBNJ Agreement and the relevant RFMO. States party to the BBNJ are legally obliged under the agreement to endeavour to promote the objectives of the agreement when participating in decision-making in other bodies. It is possible that the BBNJ Agreement could lift the standards of RFMOs indirectly through such states proposing measures that are consistent with the BBNJ Agreement. Such a lifting of standards occurred under the Fish Stocks Agreement in 1995, when RFMOs introduced standards that were consistent with the Fish Stocks Agreement, even though not all members of the RFMO had yet signed that treaty. So it is possible. However, when in current climates, certain RFMO member states are uninterested, seemingly, in agreeing to conservation initiatives, it is likely that there will be an uphill battle in those organisations for this indirect influence to be successful. It comes as no surprise that states were interested in maximising their self-interest during the BBNJ negotiations, or that important fishing states wanted to minimise or exclude the application of the BBNJ Agreement to fisheries. Decisions made in RFMOs are made between the states, only the states, that have a common interest in exploitation of the relevant fish stocks. The idea that the rest of the international community might want to have a say in how fishing is undertaken would be anathema to those states. And yet, in my view, the international community does have a real interest in how well RFMOs are managing biodiversity essentially under their control. A second potential limitation on the impact of the BBNJ Agreement is that none of the underlying structural problems contained in UNCLOS or indeed in international law are addressed. Again, this is no surprise to anyone who was following the negotiations. Although the 1994 and to some extent the 1995 implementing agreements amended key provisions or elaborated on them in very important ways, there was very little interest in taking a similarly ambitious approach in the BBNJ Agreement. In addition, the principle of pacta tertius will apply to the new agreement. This means that only parties to the agreement will be bound by the principles and procedures in the treaty. This means, so we can imagine that some key states will not ratify the treaty. Certainly Russia won't, probably the United States won't, and there may be some concern over whether Japan and China will ratify the treaty. This might mean that key ocean-going states will not be bound by decisions, including in the establishment of marine protected areas or in the sharing of benefits from the use of marine genetic resources. It is very easy for companies and vessels to move their operations or reflag to new countries to avoid additional burdens imposed by the new agreement. If a major geoengineering company wants to conduct large-scale experiments on the high seas, they would logically choose to base themselves in a country that won't impose the pretty rigorous environmental impact assessment procedure contained in the treaty. Similarly, companies that are interested in developing biodiversity from species found on the high seas may choose to base themselves in countries not party to the BBNJ Agreement. A third and slightly lesser worry for me is the role of the Conference of the Parties. My hope had been that once the COP was established, it might take an expansive role in developing positions on a wide range of issues that impact on marine biodiversity, and not limit itself to the 4 elements of the package. This would go some way to addressing the broader institutional gap that was left when UNCLOS did not create a governance body. Whether that happens remains to be seen. Certainly, the states negotiating the agreement did not seem keen to focus on creating broader obligations beyond the specific elements of the package. While whether the COP will take on a broader governance role will depend entirely on the political will of the states that ratify the agreement. In 1992, in a seminal article, Philip Ellett argued that UNCLOS was the beginning of a shift from treaties that simply aggregate state interests to a focus on an international public interest. In looking back at the slow and limited development of the BBNJ Agreement, while it was a wonderful achievement, I am not optimistic that this move to public interests is actually happening. Evolution through iterative development of the law based on principles set out in UNCLOS is less and less looking like it is capable of solving the difficult problems that face the ocean today. So this takes us to whether new approaches are needed. My current research project is based on a Marsden grant that I am working on with Dr. Ruby Moynihan-Magsig and Professor Richard Barnes. In the project called Reimagining Ocean Law, for which I have stolen the title of this lecture, we are examining critiques of international law and less explored ideas to determine whether we can find a better way to manage the ocean. And in the next part of my address, I just want to touch on 2 of the ideas we're exploring that might lead to a legal approach better equipped to deliver sustainability. The first of these is to explore what it means for the ocean to be viewed as a global commons. A global commons is an area or resource which is held in common by a group. Fish stocks on the high seas are a classic example of a global commons resource. The tragedy of the commons tells us that it is preferable for access to and use of a commons resource to be regulated to prevent unsustainable exploitation, which ultimately undermines the interest in the group in the long term. In the law of the sea, we see two quite different principles that govern commons resources. The first is the freedom of high seas, which governs fisheries. The second example is the common heritage of humankind, which applies to deep seabed mineral resources. The treaty, UNCLOS, provided for the sharing of benefits from the exploitation of seabed resources. Although the BBNJ Agreement does not directly say it, the genesis of the benefit sharing provisions was the Global South's insistence on using in some way the concept of common heritage of humankind. In my current research, I'm interested in a third approach, which considers the underlying principles or values that emerge from the fact that the ocean is a commons area. This approach asks, if the ocean is a commons area, what are the principles that determine how it should be regulated? And this is not a question of whether common heritage should apply or the freedoms of the high seas should apply. This approach begins by asking what the interests of the international community are in the way the commons is governed. And again, I will make comments largely focused on fisheries, and apologies to those of you from the Ministry of Primary Industries in the audience. I have been somewhat a bit critical of fisheries. On the one hand, we have the fishing states achieving a benefit from the resources. The benefit is captured, and it's also true that smaller groups of states are not always managing the impact of fishing on the stock or the environment well. On the other hand, the entire international community has an interest in protecting the marine environment and ensuring fisheries are caught sustainably. This includes ensuring the oceans remain healthy for climate and ecological health, as well as ensuring that resources are not overexploited so that future generations can benefit from the environmental services of those resources. And once we identify those values, my argument is that any exploitation or activity in the oceans can sit on top but not detract from those values. To the extent that regulatory regimes are inconsistent with the values, then they should be changed to reflect the values. So what should those values be? Well, first of all, the protection of the marine environment should be the starting point for discussions about exploitation. No individual actor should be able to capture the value of commons resources in a way that takes away from the community interests. Thus, economic activity should take place in a way that is sustainable and preserves the environment for future generations. There are clear obligations under UNCLOS and many other international instruments, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, to ensure protection of the marine environment. But as I discussed earlier, international law also provides ways for states to act in ways that degrade the environment. States often focus on their rights and spend less time thinking about their obligations. Second, organisations that regulate activities impacting on the marine environment should be accountable to the international community. This is particularly important for organisations such as RFMOs, where decisions are made by a closed subset of the international community. Thus, transparency is required to allow for accountability, as well as mechanisms through which that accountability can be exercised. Third, if a resource or area is owned or shared or by the international community that all have an interest, it follows that use of that resource should be equitable to some extent. Although many RFMOs have treaties that include a mandate including equity, a recent study showed that the role that this principle plays in allocation decisions is variable and unable to be adequately measured. More important considerations in those decisions are the historical catch, which favours larger existing fishing states. Although there is a reference to values such as equity, Seto et al. Tell us that the actual allocation of resource rights is shaped by the power, influence, and occasional coercion of individual states rather than the outlined equity principles. So in my view, it is worth thinking a little bit more creatively. In my Law of the Sea class, I often say to my students that the legal regime in UNCLOS is not where I would start if I was designing a new regime to manage human activities on the oceans. So perhaps we need to spend some time thinking about what an ideal approach would look like. For example, a minor form of revolution would be to ask experts to determine the capacity of the marine environment to support fishing activities. Once that capacity is set, only then would political decisions about allocation happen. A form of area-based management is required, so the impact of all activities across all sectors is planned for. More radically, we might even imagine some form of sharing of benefits from the exploitation of fisheries resources, especially on the high seas. The second category that we will be exploring, and this is more in the future, are ideas that challenge current assumptions that humans are entitled to order the oceans as they see fit. Some scholars have argued that the law of the sea is based on deeply colonialist and capitalist approaches that treat the ocean and its environment as resources to be exploited. Instead, we should be rethinking the very foundation of our legal structures. Another recent development has been that is calling on nature to have rights. Quite a few jurisdictions have now passed legislation recognising the rights of particular ecosystems, including in New Zealand. This approach recognises the responsibility that humans have in respect of the environment and recognises nature as a rights-bearing subject rather than an object to be owned. A rights of nature approach builds on the idea that humans are in a reciprocal relationship with nature. Human use or activities are conditional on the responsibility to ensure they stay within ecological limits. This idea of reciprocity appears in a range of different places, including in many Indigenous perspectives on the environment. Our research will be diving into these different perspectives to see what they can offer in reshaping the law applying to oceans. Some of these are listed on the slide and many overlap. For example, the concept of stewardship is the idea that the current international community is only borrowing the environment from future generations, and that came up in the discussion about global commons. Other approaches argue that the environment cannot be considered as separate from human beings, and the relationship between people and the oceans must be more in balance. So what can be done? Of course, if one accepts there is truth in the theoretical critiques of the current international legal system and the law of the sea, the question remains, so what? How practically can these critiques be used to reshape the legal order in a way that achieves important outcomes? As an academic, it is tempting and easy to simply reply, well, that's my job to have a theoretical discussion. But the legal part of my brain refuses to leave the analysis there. And that's something that we'll be thinking about as we go through our project. So one conclusion might be that revolution is needed. But the revolution that is necessary, according to the most critical perspectives, would require the international community to agree to scrap the entire existing legal order in favour of something else. I would argue it's akin to the difficulty in convincing the permanent members of the Security Council to vote to eliminate the veto power. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas. The chances of states giving up their vested interests without some sort of existential crisis is relatively slim. So this leads me in a full circle to ask whether revolution is possible through evolution. In other words, are there paths to a very different outcome using the existing mechanisms? The reality is that change is really forced by law. Law, especially international law, is a mechanism through which states organise their own affairs. In order to achieve transformative change, states themselves have to recognise that their interests lie in true sustainability and a different mode of thinking about the ocean. The recent calls for a moratorium on deep seabed mining perhaps indicates that some states are beginning to see the critical importance of protecting the marine environment. Over time, possibly more states will come to the same view. But in reality, there would need to be a groundswell of support in the international community for a different way of doing things to achieve transformative change. This would require a conversation that includes political leaders and their constituents. As I tell my students, international law is shaped by politicians who are motivated by what their constituents and local communities care about. So perhaps the change starts there, and even with the audience in this room. Before I finish, I just want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming tonight and to those who gave their apologies. Working as an academic is not always the easiest job in the world, but I do believe it is one of the most rewarding. There are a number of former students in the room, and I thank you for coming. Teaching is one of the joys of my life, and it comforts me that the future is in the hands of passionate, motivated, and intensely clever people. Thank you also to my colleagues. The law faculty here at Te Herenga Waka is full of amazingly talented people who care about their students and care about their environment, about their research, both the academic and the professional staff, who are simply amazing. I am humbled every day by their commitment to the law and to the university. Thank you also to my family, including my dad and my sister, my niece and nephew, and my husband's family who are here tonight. And finally, I want to say a very special thank you to my husband, Esko. I didn't expect that. Esko, you have been my rock and personal cheerleader for the last 12 years, so thank you very much for your love and support. So thank you, everyone. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
I think that response says it all. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm Professor Lee Godden, and it is my great pleasure to be the Dean of the law school that contains Joanna Mossop in it. I'd like to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Nick Smith, faculty colleagues, students, and people who've gathered here today, but particularly to acknowledge Joanna's family and husband, and to recognise in that acknowledgement the type of support that is needed to continue to support and have the achievement that Joanna has demonstrated tonight comes from a place of much love and support, so recognising that. And also, it's my particular pleasure to propose the vote of thanks to the colleague that has given you such a wonderful insight to the law of the sea, evolution and revolution. I have some very similar research interests, so it's very much my pleasure to be able to look across the work that Joanna has done. But I'm a landlubber, so much of my work around sustainability comes from freshwater and from land-based environmental law. The only time I ventured into the law of the sea, and particularly the high seas, was in respect of land-based marine plastic pollution. I hastily retreated because it is complex, it is fraught politically, as Joanna has demonstrated, but it also is dealing with such important issues for us and our world as it evolves. I was struck by the clarity, the conciseness, and the succinct way in which Joanna dealt with those complex ideas and law. I applaud her insights into thinking about how we might move forward from the vexed UNCLOS high seas regime that has as well as many wonderful features, as Joanna has said, also has some entrenched and long-standing problems about how we govern common resources. So for those insights that you've offered to us today, Thank you very much, Joanna. They are very important insights that are there that will be a platform for future research, and I wish you well in those projects and in that thinking. And that is one of the joys of academic life, teaching, but also the time for reflection and research. I'd also like to just take a couple of moments to recognise Joanna's contribution to the faculty in other ways. Joanna is a very well-regarded colleague. She is supportive of her colleagues in all sorts of ways, both big and small. Can I just also thank Joanna as a fairly new dean when she invited me to dinner along with new early career researchers in the faculty. And that just gives you some idea of the generosity and collegiality of Joanna. She also is held in high esteem by her colleagues in terms of her fine scholarship, her outreach and impact. After Joanna attended those treaty negotiations, she came back to her office and colleagues, very good friends, had put a paddling pool in her office. Lots of a little bit of sand, water and things, and just acknowledged the congratulations to Joanna on her participation in the treaty around the high seas in that gesture. And that gesture, I think, speaks again volumes about the regard that Joanna is held in. And if I could just also take a moment for a reflection from Professor Yvette Tinsley. As a faculty member, Joanna is passionate about protecting and improving law school culture for both staff and students. She does this through her willingness to take on administrative roles within the faculty, through her commitment to support and dissemination of research, and through her care for students. I wish to thank Joanna on behalf of the Faculty of Law for her commitment to supporting research development during her time as Associate Dean Research. Joanna's particular support of early career researchers was of great benefit to the faculty and is to be commended. So can I just finish then by acknowledging the wonderful journey, seaward journey, that Joanna has taken us on tonight, and to recognise it's a moment of celebration for us all and a joy to offer this vote of thanks here today. So I would ask you to share once again in showing gratitude and celebration of Professor Joanna Mossop's achievements. Thank you.